Well, I hope you had a good evening, and we have a full day ahead of us that you're going to enjoy a great deal. Our first speaker, wonderfully, is Ambassador Peter Pham, who has had a very distinguished diplomatic career and lives here in Washington, D.C. as an active Episcopalian. And we were very grateful that he spoke to a conference on Anglican political theology that we hosted here in Washington last year with some profound insights on what the Anglican tradition brings to public policy and statecraft. And so I believe he may touch on some of those themes in his talk this morning, maybe, but we'll find out. So Ambassador Pham, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Mark, and thanks for the invitation, the opportunity to be here this morning. I was just about to quip that this is looking like church, but then they filled it up. Because my church, the front rows are usually empty, and people start sitting from the back, and the most contested seats are the one farthest from the front. I thought my time is brief, but I thought would be useful to give kind of a slightly different kind of approach to it. And I told Mark I entitle my remarks Mission Africa, the Stakes in the 21st Century's Continent of Hope. I've had the blessing in my life to work on an area that I've been passionate about since before I knew enough to realize what I was passionate about, and that's the continent of Africa. And I've been very blessed to spend my career working on that as a political scientist, as a diplomat, and increasingly also on the corporate side. And that may seem like an odd fascination, and my parents certainly wondered about me in my career choices. In fact, I think for a long time they worried whether I was going to be able to support myself being passionate on what it seemed to them to be a hopeless continent, as one famous cover of The Economist had about a quarter of a century ago. But I think increasingly it is the continent of hope for the 21st century. And why is it strategic? Why am I talking about it at a conference that's focusing on realism, Christian realism, and national security? And I'd like to make 5 points about why this is an important topic, and why perhaps we should focus more about it on a strategic level, and then delve a little bit into why, as believers, as followers of Jesus, as Christians, we ought to be interested. First, on a strategic level, and if we think strategically, and I know my good friend Bridge Colby was here yesterday telling focus on priorities. First, the sheer diplomatic weight of Africa. It's the largest bloc in any international organization or forum, 54 votes. And they often vote as a bloc. There are various and sundry reasons for that, and we can get into that if you want to, but that's a solid bloc representing almost 30% of the votes in most international organizations, including the United Nations General Assembly. Second, there's a demographic shift going on. By 2050, which isn't that far away, now by that time, hopefully I will be retired, but especially the young people in the room, I address myself to you, you'll be at the well into your careers, in fact, perhaps at the apex of your careers. By 2050, 1 in 4 working age persons on this planet is going to be an African. 1 in 4. It's the youngest continent on the planet. The median age currently is about 19. Median, not average. So it's going to be the youngest. It's going to be a motor for economic growth or potential security challenge, those numbers. If you think of Africa's most populous country, one we'll return to later in my remarks, Nigeria. Currently, the population's about 200 million. By the latter part of the century, by which time I will either be well retired or hopefully, God's grace, off to a better place, there will be 400 million Nigerians. By the end of this century, Nigeria will be the third most populous country on the planet. But it's not just sheer numbers, it's not just the youth, but it's where they're located. Africa is also the fastest urbanizing region in the world. And with that comes people living together, infrastructure and other costs go down. Economists call it agglomeration effects. But it also means that there are security challenges of people living together. Famine can happen, and it's tragic in rural areas, but generally stays there. Hunger in cities leads to social instability, riots, and all sorts of other negative effects. So, fastest urban. I'll give you an example. The city of Kinshasa, the capital of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, country I did a lot of work in the last administration, currently has, in an area the size of a typical American sprawl mid-sized city. I was just in Omaha, and it was a perfect because the municipal boundaries are virtually the same area. Omaha has 487,000 people in 156 square miles. Kinshasa has 16.5 million. Third thing, economic significance. We usually don't think of Africa as economically significant, but in the decade leading up to the pandemic, 7 of the 20 fastest growing economies in the world were in Africa. In 2019, the last year before the pandemic, 5 of the top 10 fastest growing economies in the world were in Africa. And it's not just commodities, it's all sorts of things. And this is a market opportunity, obviously, for our business, American business. And with that economy comes adoption of technology. Now, again, something counterintuitive. We usually don't think of Africa as a technological innovator, but in certain financial settings it is. For example, more of Africa's economies move by mobile money than any other place in the world. I sort of laugh every time my bank sends me a thing to have me sign up for mobile payments directly without using cards and all those other things, much less cash. I laugh because to them it's the latest and greatest scheme. For Africans, it's something that's more than a decade old. In Kenya, a quarter of the economy moves by M-Pesa, a payment system developed and used by Safaricom, the leading mobile phone provider in that country. Fourth reason why this is strategic, critical minerals, resources. Just a few data points, and one could throw lots out there, but I just want to throw a few to tease it out. Cobalt. Cobalt is absolutely necessary for all sorts of high-tech functions, specifically with electric vehicles. Now, whatever one thinks of Mr. Musk and Tesla, whatever one thinks of environmental issues, whatever one thinks of the practicality of it, the fact is electric vehicles and all sorts of renewable energy works are there. Can't ignore them. And whatever technologies have yet to be discovered. Cobalt, 70% of the world's cobalt is produced in one country, the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Another data point, copper. Without copper, we don't have electric wiring. Without electric wiring, this green revolution isn't going anywhere. The International Energy Agency, which is an umbrella group that was established after the Arab oil embargo of the early 1970s to monitor energy and energy usage and try to coordinate in some fashion, issued a report a week ago estimating that to achieve the energy goals that the United States, the European Union, and other countries have pledged to achieve by 2050, whatever one thinks of them, to achieve those somewhat minimalistic energy goals, one has to add 50 million miles of electric cabling on the planet between now and 2040. 50 million, which, if you were wondering what 50 million miles of cabling are, that's equal to all the electric wiring and cabling that exists currently on the planet. We have to double, and that can't be done without copper. And how are we going to do this without sufficient copper? Since especially in our country, we've made the political choice, or at least certain people have made the political choice, that we're not going to mine it here. Again, another reason Africa is, in fact, last year, Congo, a country I'm very familiar with, shot up to be the world's second largest producer of copper. And then there are all sorts of other esoteric minerals. Unfortunately for us, and this is the challenge, and I tie this back to my friend Bridge Colby's talk to you yesterday, most of the processing and mining is currently done by China. 17 of the 18 cobalt mines in the DRC are operated by China. And if you'll forgive me a little bit of political commentary on the side, including the biggest one, the Tenke mine, which was title was passed to a Chinese state-owned company through the good services of a certain Mr. Hunter Biden. And that's in the New York Times. Finally, of course, security concerns. Not just jihadism and the crisis of state legitimacy and the coups you've heard about, but geopolitical competition. Our geopolitical competitors, China, Russia, have upped their game in Africa. Regional competitors, or powers, however you want to look at Turkey, the Gulf Arab states have likewise upped their game. And the former colonial powers, the UK, France, have increasingly, our allies there have increasingly been pushed off the continent, especially the French who this week are being kicked out of Niger. Now, all those reasons for why this topic, I think, is important and deserves more, on a strategic level, more consideration. But beyond that, and I think this is where I can address this conference, Africa is also a land of opportunity, not just on the geopolitical, geoeconomic level, but also on the level of believers. Although Christianity, of course, has a very old history on the African continent, dating back to the earliest days, to the book of Acts, Philip and the conversation with the Ethiopian eunuch and his conversion, back to New Testament times. Of course, Alexandria in Egypt was a center of Christianity in the early days, from St. Mark's arrival there all the way through to the theological, Christological controversies of the 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries. And of course, Ethiopia, one of the oldest Christian countries in the world. But yet, in 1900, there were 7 million Christians on the African continent. 7 million, roughly 9% of the population. The last year for which we have relatively accurate data. There are some estimates, but really accurate counting. 2010, there were 470 million Christians on the continent, roughly 57% of the population in sub-Saharan Africa. Christians in Africa represent roughly, currently, a quarter of all Christians on our planet. And while the media and often scholars treat religiosity as somewhat of a static character on the African continent, what's been very interesting to monitor as a phenomenon, and one that's really largely underreported, is the number of Muslims on the African continent who convert to Christianity. Just to cite one example, Uganda. Best sociological, anthropological data says that in Uganda, long-term data, roughly 1/3 of those born and raised Muslim at some point in their life, midlife, later in life, become Christian. And that's an overlooked factor often when we talk about religious dynamics. Some of you, although at least I look around the faces, some may be a little young for this, but some of us will remember 2014 and the schoolgirls kidnapped from Chibok in northeastern Nigeria. And one largely overlooked fact, and I kind of berate the media for failing to point this out, with the exception, by the way, of Joe Parkinson and Drew Hinshaw of the Wall Street Journal, who actually wrote an excellent book, if you really want a whole book on the subject. Most of the media didn't bat an eye and kept repeating the same nostrums that northern Nigeria is Muslim, southern Nigeria is Christian, and the country is evenly divided. Drew and Joe, who are friends of mine, pointed out that, well, if that was true, then a couple of days after the kidnapping, the jihadists who kidnapped them from Boko Haram wouldn't have needed to have converted those girls to Islam, forced conversion, if they were already Muslim. And the fact is, as Drew and Joe point out in their excellent book, which came out 2 years ago, was that most of them were actually, although they were in the north, Christian, and it was a Christian village that they were kidnapped from. The growth of Christianity in Nigeria. By the way, spirituality in Africa, and this is why I say it's a land of mission, is a much more intense, if you look at sociological experience, than other places. 1/3 of Africans polled, irrespective of their own, have witnessed a healing or an exorcism. 61% of Christians in Africa surveyed expect Jesus to return in their lifetimes. On the other side of the ledger, 52% of Muslims on the continent expect the caliphate to be restored in their lifetimes. Nigeria, I said I'd return to that. Some interesting statistics to throw out there about why this is strategic, why it ought to be of concern to us. Last year, Open Doors World Watch, which is an excellent survey for those who don't know it, on Christian persecution around the globe. 90% of the Christians murdered for their faith in the world last year were in one country, in Nigeria. 5,621 Christians were killed for their faith between October 1, 2021 and September 30th, 2022. In a few months, we'll have the figures for last year. Of those 5,621 fellow believers, 5,014 were in Nigeria, making Nigeria arguably the most dangerous place on the planet to follow Jesus. Nigeria also ranked number 1 in homes and businesses attacked for faith-based reasons. And where it came in second is hardly comforting. Number 2 in attacks on houses of worship. Number one being China, of course. So, some sobering statistics. On one hand, we have Africa as a strategic stake, but above and beyond the purely worldly stakes, those of us who profess a belief in Jesus and the faith also have the consideration of the religiosity and the persecution of fellow believers. So there's a lot at stake. And I'll close with one final comment, and that is in the foreign policy of the current U.S. administration, there has been an increasing attack, I would argue, on the religious faith and sensibilities of our African friends. Just this week, the U.S. State Department issued a business advisory against doing business in Uganda, telling American businesses and investors that they risk reputational harm by doing business in a country that, according to the U.S. State Department, oppresses LGBTQ plus individuals. Now, whether the legislation recently signed into law in Uganda is prudent, the virtue of prudence, that I think people can debate. But to single out Uganda as a place where warnings should be done in business, when no such warnings have been issued in other places, and I would note places like Iran, where I don't think the diversity agenda fares much better, or other places is somewhat hypocritical, but I think it does signal something. So with that, let me just stop with just one last word for you, which is the importance of this content. It's a passion of mine, I know, and maybe eccentric, but I would argue that, especially for the young people in the room, this is a place where the future is full of promise, full of hope, and yet full of challenge. And arguably the most strategic competition is being engaged. Our foes on every side have already figured this out, and it's time for us to wake up. Thank you very much. Okay. First hand up.
Thank you very much. My name is Elizabeth Nishala. I'm from Taylor University. You mentioned at the beginning of your talk these pre-pandemic numbers having to do specifically with the economy. How did the COVID pandemic impact Africa?
It certainly stopped a lot of the economic growth. The number of fatalities, and this is an interesting one, and I'm not a scientist, a biological scientist, so I'm not going to speak to why. The numbers were certainly nowhere near what those who were panicking thought they would be. Now, whether that is because of inborn immunity, because of whatever, that needs to be studied. But certainly the death tolls are nowhere near the numbers that one would have anticipated for an area that doesn't have the health infrastructure or the ability to enforce the type of draconian measures that we did in our own country. And I think that's something people are going to have to figure out why. And I'm not an epidemiologist, so I'll wait for the numbers to be crunched and the data to be collected. It remains to be seen why that was. So it didn't suffer the consequences, but the overall decline in trade, the overall decline in demand for resources certainly negatively affected the economies. But many of them have also bounced back relatively rapidly. So we'll see. I don't like statistics of in 1 year. That's why I use the statistics of over a decade. Any 1 year you can have a blip. A place like South Sudan where can have the fastest growth in the world because the year before they were in the middle of a civil war, the economy plummeted down to next to nothing. So you're going to have huge growth if you stop fighting for a little bit. But that that's not, you have to look over a certain period of time. Yeah. Okay, so first the gentleman in the far back. In the far back, in the back row.
Thank you very much. Humberto Limons with Brownstein. Professor, let me first say that I do agree with you that Africa is important, and it is probably most important since it has been since the 1960s. But what exactly should we do? Should we charter private companies to buy land and mine in the Congo? Should we send troops to Nigeria? What exactly should our appropriate response be to maintain our interests in the sub-Saharan African region?
One, we need a strategy. And I would argue that we had one, not without its flaws, but we had one in the last administration. And I don't say that because I wrote most of it. But a strategy has to have a couple things. One, a proper strategy, and I'm sure some of the speakers yesterday spoke about this, you have to identify your objectives, what it is you're trying to achieve. You have to identify what means you have resources to achieve those objectives. And then you've got to connect those two with a plan of how to go about one to the other. And that's a proper strategy. It sounds very elementary. But the other thing about it is you often can't put it out there because obviously certain things can't be said for either security reasons or simply diplomatic reasons. The last administration's strategy was, and remains, by the way, classified. And the reason it was classified was specific. You can't signal everything public. You can say certain broad outlines, but you can't say, these are our priorities, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, because that gives it all away. And not to mention, if you list, these are our priority countries, God help you, there'll be, there are 54 countries. If you list 5 priorities, there are going to be 49 very angry people, at the very least. So it had to be classified. The current administration's so-called strategy document on Africa is entirely open. They published it. You can get it on the White House website. Well, needless to say, you can't list priorities because someone's going to be offended. So you list all sorts of things. It's a list of things that many of which are unobjectionable, but you can't do everything. The good Lord can, but we creatures have limited means, and so you have to make those decisions. So a proper strategy, 1. 2, recognize the importance of the private sector. By the way, through administrations, Democrat and Republican, foreign assistance to Africa, whatever you think of foreign assistance, has been relatively constant, fluctuating given our economic cycle, budget cycles. But over the last 15 years, roughly between $6.5 billion to $7.5 billion a year in government foreign assistance to Africa. 75% of which, by the way, is eaten up by health related expenses. The President's Emergency Program for AIDS Relief, PEPFAR, and other programs, with 25% just left for everything else: democracy promotion, governance issues, everything else. Last year, the private sector, the American private sector alone, invested in Africa about $46.2 billion. So it's clearly the private sector that's going to drive this, not government money. Government money can, in certain circumstances, be leveraged, but certainly has its limits. And then we have to start thinking about it strategically. We're in an era where I think the lack of attention to Africa is almost as criminally negligent on the part of our political leaders as it would have been if in the 1970s, and we did have a little episode of this, we decided to turn our back and not pay any attention to the Middle East. And of course, we had that little adventure through history during the, except for the Israel-Egypt peace, during the Carter administration and the Iran hostage crisis and everything else. We're at that same type of inflection point with regard to the African continent, and we need to pay attention. But thank you for your question.
Thank you, Dr. Pham. So I've kind of got a three-part question, but it all goes together. So you talked a lot about economic development in Africa, but I was just wondering if there was a certain country that you saw as a democratic leader, and also I was wondering what evidence you would use to justify, because there has been a lot of coups, and there's a lot of different experiences in Africa, so I don't want to oversimplify, but I was just wondering what you thought would be a model of democracy in Africa, and also the other part of the question, Max Weber's The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism came to mind during your talk, because I was wondering if, like, one of the things Weber suggests is that Christian ethics aligns with a lot of other ethical ideas that align with capitalism, and whether you consider democracy to be a ethic as well. So I was wondering if you can see Christianity playing a role in a cultural shift that would move a certain country toward democracy, like if Christianity has a role in promoting democracy in Africa. Hopefully all of that made sense, but yeah.
Okay, well, thank you for your question. First, let me start with the question on coups. We're very quick to condemn coups, and I certainly am not an advocate for coups. But that being said, the presupposition is that what came before the coup was democratic or legitimate, and that's often either superficial reporting or simply not true. A good example is a country I know very well, and in fact lived in my youth, Guinea, the Republic of Guinea, Conakry. Now, Guinea had a very tragic history. It was the first country to break free of France, but it followed a Marxist ideologue who never failed to make the wrong choice when he had an opportunity. After they got independence from France, Eisenhower reached out, and he rebuffed Eisenhower and went with the Soviet Union. Then when the Soviet Union had its schism with Communist China, he followed Communist China. Anyway, long story short, that first Sekou Touré, the independence leader, when he finally died, he died at the Cleveland Clinic because the medical facilities in his country that he ran weren't sufficient, so he had the luxury of going to the Cleveland Clinic. He was followed by Lansana Conté, who was his hangman, literally hangman. Lansana Conté was an interesting character, and every day he went to Sekou Touré's house, and Sekou Touré had a calendar on his wall. It was like one of those one-sheet-a-day calendars. And at the end of the day, he would tear off the page, and on the back in pencil would write down the names of the people to be taken into custody and executed that night for whatever alleged reasons in his mind. And they would be hung from the Castro Bridge. Again, the name of the bridge itself saying something about Sekou Touré. And toward the end of Sekou Touré's life, Lansana Conté, his hangman, figured out that no one was actually checking if he added a few names to the list every night. And so he systematically eliminated anyone who might be a rival. So when Sekou Touré went off to eternal judgment, all of Lansana Conté's rivals had been strung up at one point or another in the preceding several years. So he got the presidency and kept it until his death in 2008. Finally, there were elections held in 2010. And the reason I'm going into detail is to illustrate this point. The elections in 2010, for me, the results were fixed. And fixed by the former colonial power in an attempt to get back in. In the first round, the leading candidate was a former Prime Minister, Cellou Diallo, who got 42% of the vote. Second place was a left-wing oppositionist who'd been in exile and spent most of his time in cafes on the left bank in Paris, Alpha Condé, got 17%. So it had to go to a runoff. In the runoff, candidates 3 and 4, who between the two of them had 20% of the vote, endorsed the first. They thought they knew which way the thing was going, so they endorsed the first place finisher. So even presuming for the sake of argument that they could, those two characters could only, Sidia Touré and I forget the name of the fourth guy, could only get half their followers to vote the way they wanted, that alone would have put Selou Diallo over the finish line. And yet, in a strange turn of events, somehow the first place finisher lost votes despite the endorsements in the second round, and Alpha Condé was declared the winner in 2010. And invited to the White House under President Obama as an example of the new democratic Africa. 2015, he runs for re-election, and that fiasco of all sorts of problems with it, and wins, in quotation marks, re-election. In 2020, he changes the Constitution to get rid of term limits and wins a landslide. So fast forward September 5th, 2021, a military group overthrew him. My point being, yes, that was a military coup, but was what came before a democratic regime. And I would argue that, no, it was actually, an illegitimate government that was never a democracy. It held, elections with pre-cooked results. And so when you when you give people no chance to vote you out or vote you in, for that matter, and someone throws you out, is that necessarily the same thing as the overthrow of a truly democratically elected government? And I think these are some of the questions that one needs to ask. I'm not justifying coups, but I do think we need to look at what comes before that. I think much more important is your other question, which is there something, and I would agree with you, and Weber, to a certain extent, in the fact that I think there is something in Christianity, the respect for the individual, the idea of grace, and a whole bunch of other things that we can solve that predispose a country to both a democratic transition and to sustaining that afterwards. And in fact, if we look at the countries around Africa that have, without whatever flaws they may have, been able to more or less avoid military coups, and many of them have a very strong, if not a Christian majority, a strong Christian presence, or in some cases, even where it's overwhelmingly Muslim, Senegal being a good example, where a strong ethos, despite the numbers. In Senegal, the Christian population is possibly 10%. But the first president, Leopold Sédar Senghor, who governed the country and was the first African leader to step down and retire peacefully when he stepped down in 1980, was himself a Christian in a Muslim country and established a pattern that to now has prevailed. The country's never had a military coup. So I think there is something there. Can't generalize very easily, but you can look at other places where the economy's moving. Kenya, again, a very strong Christian presence. There's a large Muslim community, but also imprinted certainly with Christianity. And even places that are far from perfect, good example being South Africa. The long-standing Christian ethos of the country enabled certain things. Whatever one thinks of the current government, I don't think very much of it, but the fact that they were able to have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission after the years of apartheid was based upon a Christian understanding of confession, forgiveness, redemption that doesn't make sense without taken away from that matrix. I think, right there, you're right.
Good morning. My name is Kendrick Thiessen from Cairn University. You talked a lot about the future and prosperous of African countries. Nigeria specifically, I wanted to talk about the confidence of their government, where they are ranked very low in confidence and high in corruption. And I wanted you to talk about or hear your thoughts on how we combat that and how we can see that country moving forward.
Okay, thank you. Well, if you'd asked me that question 3.5 months ago, I would have said the new government was off to a good start. And this is the glass half empty or glass half full. On one hand, President Bola Tinubu, who took over, has achieved in his first 100 days a whole bunch of changes that had eluded many of his predecessors. One, he's allowed the naira to float, the currency to float, instead of having fixed exchange rates which are artificially set and provide all sorts of arbitrage opportunities for the politically connected, but didn't serve the country's economy much good. He also got rid of the fuel subsidy, which was a vast suckhole for government expenditures, and again, didn't really benefit people. So 2 major achievements that eluded his predecessors, and he did that in the first 100 days. Unfortunately, more recently, in diplomacy, you learn very quickly. If you're going to be successful, never make a promise or threat that you aren't able and willing to carry out. And they made all sorts of threats about intervening in Niger after the coup that, frankly, if he'd consulted a minimally competent military planner, they would have told him this is impossible. Instead, he kind of charged ahead, and now they've painted themselves into a corner and don't know how to climb down. However, he did achieve, by threatening that military intervention, uniting everyone. So I guess he achieved national unity, except it was against him. The leading Muslim organization in the country, the JNI, spoke out against it. The Roman Catholic bishops had a very strong statement against it, and most recently, the Anglican Archbishop of the Anglican Church of Nigeria came out against it. So he's now managed to unite the 3 largest religious groups in the country against him. So in that sense, he's achieved national unity. I don't think in the way he intended. He also, is going to be and I'll make a prediction, a one-term president. The man is not his claimed age. He claims to be 70, which is rather miraculous and precocious of him, considering several years ago, it's all over social media, his daughter had her 60th birthday. Very precocious young man, quite clearly. But clearly, he's, one can do the math as to what age he more likely is now. Of course, Americans, we should be a little more humble and not make too much about aged presidents, since people could point out some embarrassing things to us. So, we have time for one more. One more. Okay, the young lady midway through the room. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Lindsay Heiser. I'm from Messiah University. My question is just, what do you think is going to happen moving forward for the Christians in Africa? Do you think the numbers are going to increase with the death rates, decrease, and how would America be able to step in and help moving forward?
Well, I think the church is on a trajectory of growth, and it's the same pattern in the church throughout the ages. Tertullian wrote about this in the 3rd century. The blood of Christians is the seed of the church, and where there's powerful witness, there's growth. How American react? One is by calling spades spades. In the last administration, we had a Secretary of State who took these issues very seriously, and designated countries, including where Christians were, like Nigeria, where 90% of the world's martyrs are being produced, and labeled that a country of concern. The current administration delisted Nigeria from that concern, and the listing was so irregular that even its appointees to the International Religious Freedom Commission, bodies established by its own appointees, in their annual report last year, questioned how they came about that decision, because no one could point to any data of significant improvement. So I think we have to be candid about that and include that. I mean, for all the reasons we should pay attention to the minerals, the economies, the demographics, all that, I think as believers, it's incumbent upon us to have a little bit of solidarity with our brothers and sisters. So, thank you.